Good afternoon, and welcome to the Library of Congress. Thank you for joining us today at the Thomas Jefferson Building. I would also like to welcome those of you joining us on Zoom. I'm Michael Stratmone, a program specialist at the Kluge Center. Before we begin today's program, please take a moment to silence your cell phones and other electronic devices. I'll also remind you that this afternoon's program is being filmed for placement on the Kluge Center's website, as well as our YouTube and iTunes channels. The Kluge Center was founded in 2000, thanks to a generous donation from philanthropist John W. Kluge. The center is a vibrant community of scholarship on Capitol Hill. We bring together scholars and researchers from around the world to use the library's vast resources and to interact with and inform policymakers and the public. We also administer the Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, which will be awarded this summer. Today, the Kluge Center's Dan Torello will talk with Dr. Gene Zubovich, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Buffalo and a Kluge Fellow, about his book, Before the Religious Right, Liberal Protestants, Human Rights, and the Polarization of the United States, which was published in 2022. Before the Religious Right discusses how for much of the 20th century, religion and politics in America were shaped by liberal Protestants. Thank you, Dr. Zubovich, for joining us. And Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike and Gene. Great to see you. Thanks for being with us today and for sharing your book with us. So, Gene, your book covers over half a century of history, and you weave in political history, diplomatic history, economic history, cultural history, and of course, religious history. Tell us a little bit about what inspired you to undertake this project, and then perhaps just in way of giving us the lay of the land. We're going to get into some of the details and the stories a little bit later in the conversation. But just give us a snapshot of your main arguments.
I never expected to become a historian of religion, let alone a historian of liberal Protestantism. The way I happened onto this project is I happened upon a book written by a liberal Protestant minister, a Congregationalist in the 1940s. And this book was one of the most critical takes on American racism written by any white person prior to the 1960s. And so I was interested and curious, and so I wanted to learn more about him and the community and context from which he wrote. And that's how I came upon liberal Protestants, this politically vibrant and intellectually vibrant community, and also, as I later discovered, a flawed community as well. These were folks who, from the 1920s into the 1960s, were involved with the New Deal. They were important players in the civil rights movement, and they had played an important role in the creation of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so I wanted, as I learned more and more about them, I realized the centrality of their importance to both American history and world history. And so the reason I wrote this book is not because I'm a member of this community. I am not a liberal Protestant. It's because I recognized their centrality to many of the stories that we tell about 20th century US history.
Super. So as I was reading your book, I kept thinking of antecedents. And when we think of economic policy, many of the folks that you're writing about are actually referring back to folks like Adam Smith and Karl Marx. When we think of the international world order, questions of war and peace, we could go back even further. Tell us about where did you start the story and what accounted for your choice?
So I thought about starting with Genesis, but my editor said no, and so took a more practical approach, which is to start at the end of World War I. I start at the end of World War I. I follow liberal Protestants through the Great Depression. I look at their transformation during World War II. I follow them into the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and into the Great Society of the 1960s. I start at the end of World War I because it is a critical moment for international history. It's a moment when we see Woodrow Wilson strive to create the League of Nations, but we also see that the United States never joins the League of Nations. We hear Woodrow Wilson's calls for self-determination, but we also know that empire remains the predominant system of world governance for many decades. We hear Woodrow Wilson call for free trade and the promotion of capitalism, but we also see the creation of the world's first communist country, the USSR. And so the United States is as internationally engaged as it ever was at this moment in 1918, but it's also cutting itself off from the world in certain ways, like banning immigration. And so liberal Protestants have to kind of locate themselves and think about where they stand on these important questions of international governance and world order.
So, Gene, you're writing about a period of history that spans several decades, and it's a period during which liberal Protestant communities are playing an active role in political life, in public life, in civic life. I wonder, how did this reflect church demographics? Could you give us a picture of, what were the numbers like? Who were some of the key players? What were the geographies? Was it a rural movement? Was it more urban? What did all of this actually look like on the ground?
It's really hard to define any religious community with precision, and that's especially hard for Protestants who today are divided into more than 30,000 different denominations. So liberal Protestants are their life centered around the Federal Council of Churches in the United States and the World Council of Churches internationally. And one of the things I figured out about this community, which made up something like a quarter to a third of the United States in the mid-20th century, is that for them there was the importance of international engagement. And for them that was rooted in the ecumenical movement. The ecumenical movement began in the early 20th century, and essentially it was this theological movement to bring together Protestant denominations and Orthodox bodies from across the world into some sort of community, right? Into creating relationships between these different groups of people all throughout the world. And so in this book, I oftentimes refer to American liberal Protestants as ecumenical Protestants. And the reason I do that is to reflect the centrality of the ecumenical movement, because ultimately my book is about the ways in which discussions at the international level and the international arena, the vibrant conversations in the ecumenical movement about human rights and world order make their way back into the United States and become politically important and transform life in the United States.
So one of the wonderful things about your book is that you actually tell stories of people and of leaders and set them in their, you go into their personal history and then set them in the context of world history. One of the gentlemen that you write about early on in the narrative is a gentleman by the name of Bramley Oxnam, which is a wonderful name. And he was quite a colorful figure, and he was one of the folks who was early on was involved in some world travels. I know he went to India, and then perhaps even more interesting, in 1926 he ended up in Moscow. Tell us a little bit about Bramley Oxnam. What was he all about, and what was he up to?
They don't name them like they used to.
Yeah,
so I should backtrack a little bit, and just to say that the ecumenical movement and these ecumenical Protestants were really a diffuse movement. They were located across the United States. They were really dispersed all across the world. But at the same time, there was a real power elite at the center of this movement. The leadership came from was a small group of people located in a few square blocks of Midtown Manhattan. Before, in the 1950s, they moved in together into a single building in Morningside Heights that they affectionately called the God Box, which kind of gives you a sense of what the architecture of this building was like. So G. Bromley Oxnam is a good example of the kind of, the elite character of some of these folks. He grew up the son of an engineer from a well-to-do family in Los Angeles. He went to USC for his undergrad and lots of other kind of top-tier universities before he got his PhD at the Boston University School of Theology, which is a Methodist-run school. Eventually, G. Bromley Oxnam became probably the most famous liberal Protestant that most people have never heard of. He was on the cover of Time magazine in the 50s. He was a Methodist bishop for Washington, D.C. For several decades and was close to many presidents, and he became closely involved in the creation of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So decades before that, in the 1910s, he had been an inheritor of the social gospel movement. He created the Church of All Peoples in Los Angeles, and this was not your traditional church. It was modeled on Jane Addams' famous social settlement house, Hull House, for folks from the UK. This is similar to Toynbee Hall, if that's a familiar reference to you. So rather than having traditional services, this was a place where you could have community events in Spanish and Japanese and Yiddish and provide. This was a church that provided social services to its community. So he was an inheritor of the social gospel, but from a relatively young age, he was also exposed to internationalism. So G. Bromley Oxnam, beginning in 1918, started traveling abroad in what was called, at the time, study missions. And one of the first places they went to, G. Bromley Oxnam and other members of his generation went to India for a long period of time. And when he arrived in India, he was the prototypical ugly American. But he would later transform and change his views over time. So he gets into fights with Indian porters. He constantly complains about the sexuality he's seeing displayed in Hindu temples. He says, "I've never seen anything this bad, even in Paris," which is quite a condemnation. And he is in 1919 in India when the Amritsar massacre happens, which is a rebellion that the British Empire puts down. And he, in his diaries, applauds the move. And so in 1919, during the trip to India, G. Bromley Oxnam exhibits many of the characteristics of ecumenical Protestants during the Progressive era. So he is obsessed with sexual morality and bodily self-control. He is a supporter of European and American empire. He thinks of social welfare primarily as a form of charity. But on future trips, he starts to revise many of his views. So in the 1920s, he's frequently going to Great Britain and he's meeting with Labour Party officials and trying to figure out what politics are like and what the Labour Party is doing in the UK in the 1920s. In 1926, he travels to the Soviet Union for the first time and he meets with all levels of Soviet officials, including Stalin himself. But the most impactful encounter he has in the Soviet Union is with Georgy Chicherin, who is the Soviet foreign minister in 1926. And the reason this encounter is so important is because G. Bromley Oxnam comes to believe that the Soviet Union is going to bring about, eventually, the end of colonialism in Asia. And so through his travels from India to the UK, through the Soviet Union, you could see G. Bromley Oxnam and more broadly his generation of internationally connected Protestants change their minds about several things, to become more interested in the labor movement, to do away with the kind of moral politics that they had earlier subscribed to turn against imperialism. And so before the Great Depression and before the New Deal, this community is transforming in ways that are going to be really important in the 1930s.
So I'm intrigued by this Moscow connection, and just to set the stage, Lenin had passed away in 1924, I believe. Stalin had assumed his rule in 1922 and would rule all the way through 1953. Oxnam shows up in Moscow, as you mentioned, in 1926, so it's really the beginning of an era of Soviet history. How does this play out in the following decades? Does he remain in touch with folks in Moscow, and how does the exchange of ideas play into the debates that liberal Protestants are having in the U.S.?
When G. Bromley Oxnam comes back to the United States from his Russia trip in 1926, he is hailed as an expert on the Soviet Union, which gives you a sense of just the kind of paucity of expertise that existed in the United States for much of the rest of the world. There was a lot of expertise on Western and Central Europe, but for much of the rest of the world, liberal Protestants like G. Bromley Oxnam played a hugely important role in interpreting what's going on in the Soviet Union, in India, in China, to Americans. Right? I can't emphasize that enough. Right? This is a community that really is important in bringing large swaths of the world to the United States and interpreting the vast majority of the world for Americans in a way that few other places did prior to the Cold War, when the US government started investing in area studies departments. And so that's one observation we can make about Oxnam and his community, is that they play a hugely important role. The other thing that's interesting to me about Oxnam is you would expect Protestants, because they're dealing with an officially atheistic state, to be wary of the Soviet Union. But unlike evangelicals and unlike a broad swath of Catholic bishops in the United States, even during the Cold War, they're trying very hard not to cut themselves off from the Soviet Union, and more importantly, other communist nations like, Red China, quote unquote. And so they're really at pains to interpret what's going on in the communist world in ways that continues to allow them to link themselves up with these communities. And so they never turn to the right during the Cold War in the way that many other communities in the United States do.
So you've talked a lot about, and in the book, about how Oxnam and other leaders during this time were very much involved with during the Great Depression. They were involved in shaping the New Deal and with the FDR presidency. But there was another dynamic that was coming into play as we were getting closer to the onset of World War II, and this shifted some of the debates that were going on. How did this play out?
Yeah, the Great Depression did two things for American liberal Protestants. The first thing is it brought internationally connected leaders like G. Bromley Oxnam into positions of power in the United States. The second thing the Great Depression did was that it brought religious liberalism, particularly liberal Protestantism, closer together with the political liberalism of Franklin Roosevelt. And so liberal Protestants cooperated quite a bit with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs of the 1930s. They were closely involved in labor disputes and resolving labor disputes. People like G. Bromley Oxnam and ecumenical Protestants were closely involved in lobbying for Social Security legislation, for the Wagner Act. And so I make this point because historians have largely missed this important connection. And the reason they've missed this, I think, is because ever since Richard Hofstadter's 1955 book, The Age of Reform, historians of mid-century liberalism have argued that a key pillar of mid-century liberalism has been that it has abandoned the Protestant moralism of the progressive era. But what this take misses is the way in which liberal Protestants, ecumenical Protestants like G. Bromley Oxnam, themselves had transformed between the 19-teens and the 1930s. So on the eve of the Great Depression and the New Deal, they had no trouble reconciling their religious views and their politics. And so they got involved in political liberalism. But after this moment, by the late 1930s, when the wars began first in East Asia and then in Europe, they were deeply divided between two groups of people, one calling themselves realists and another calling themselves pacifists. And they clashed, and there were these vicious fights, really personal, heartfelt, divisive battles within this community. And they were never really resolved. But the way that ecumenical Protestants moved past these divisions is they decided, after the United States got itself involved in World War II in 1942, that they were going to not talk about the war anymore. They were going to impose a gag rule and think ahead, past the war, to the peace that would come after the war. So in early 1942, shortly after the United States joined World War II on behalf of the Allies, ecumenical Protestants launched what, in my book, I called the World Order Movement, which is the largest religious mobilization since Prohibition. And it was a movement that would do two things. First, it would try to create the conditions for a just and durable peace that would follow after World War II. And it would also try to reform the United States to make it worthy of that peace, to make it a country that would contribute in meaningful ways to that peace. So although they never were able to find common ground between these two warring camps, they were able to make this huge contribution to both, huge transformations to both the United States and to the world.
So looking at things from a slightly different vantage point, you've talked a little bit about how a lot of these movements were elite and had access to power, had access at the highest levels. A little bit later on in your book, you also talk about some movements that were a little bit more on the fringe, that were more marginal. For example, can you tell us who was Thelma Stevens, and how did she reshape the conversation around human rights?
When I think about the elite character of liberal Protestantism, I oftentimes contrast Thelma Stevens with John Foster Dulles. So when these ecumenical Protestants in the United States launched the World Order movement, G. Bromley Oxnam recruits John Foster Dulles to run this movement. Many of you will recognize Dulles as Dwight D. Eisenhower's Secretary of State during the 1950s, but back in the 1940s, he was known for being a prominent international lawyer, as well as a famous Presbyterian layman who had long been involved with the ecumenical movement. And so he's put in charge of these massive rallies designed to rally millions of Americans for a just and durable peace. And so he comes from a relatively well-to-do family, just like G. Bromley Oxnam does, but people like Thelma Stevens come from entirely different worlds. So Thelma Stevens is born in rural Mississippi from a poor farming family, and she joins liberal ecumenical institutions because they provide one of the few life paths for women who are trying to avoid domesticity and heterosexual marriage. So Thelma Stevens, like Jane Addams and a few others, Lillian Smith, for example, she never gets married. And so in the 1930s, she spends her time in the Jim Crow South, going from courtroom to courtroom where black defendants are on trial, and she's a white woman and she's sitting in the audience letting the juries and the judges and the prosecutors know that people are watching. She's trying her best to ensure that African Americans are getting fair trials in the segregated South. By the 1940s, she found herself in charge of a group of Methodist women representing approximately 2 million members. And so she, even though Dulles is the one kind of doing a lot of the high-level politics for the ecumenical movement, people like Thelma Stevens are put in charge of the day-to-day affairs of the World Order movement, the nuts and bolts, right? Even though, Protestant institutions shunned female independence during this time, they also relied on their labor. And so within this Methodist women's community, there are really lively conversations going on about human rights, and what do human rights mean for economic policy? What do human rights mean for American race relations? What do human rights mean for women and women's rights? And so there are ways in which, and I try to document this in my book, the grassroots enthusiasm for human rights among Methodist women and other groups trickle up, in a sense, right, to the position papers and white papers of Dulles and Oxnam. So when Dulles and Oxnam go to San Francisco in the spring of 1945, where the United Nations is being created, and they go to meetings where people are discussing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and what should be included and shouldn't be included, they're not only reflecting the elite views of Dulles and Oxnam, but they're also reflecting, in some ways, right, the work of Methodist women throughout the country and the forgotten activism of women like Thelma Stevens.
What an amazing story. So there's a criticism of U.S. foreign policy that we seem to hear over and over again, and it's still relevant now. We hear it now, and it's the charge of hypocrisy. So critics look at the U.S. and say, perhaps the U.S. should focus less on promoting democracy overseas and human rights overseas and focus more on its domestic politics. Some of the liberal Protestants that you're writing about seem to have taken this line of critique to heart and actually thought about it and talked about it. How did this impact the way that they were thinking about U.S. domestic policy?
This hypocrisy is really at the heart of my book. It's a book that's about the ways in which international debates and ideas make their way back into the United States and transform American politics. And so this community, ecumenical Protestants, are much more attuned to charges of American hypocrisy because they're so connected internationally. And so long before the Cold War, back in the 1920s and 1930s, American missionaries are writing back to their home congregations in the United States, and they're saying, if you want people to convert to Christianity, you really have to become less racist at home in the United States. And so out of this commitment comes a commitment to anti-racist mobilizations that continue from the 20s and 30s into World War II and into the Cold War, and becomes an important part of the American civil rights movement. There are other arenas where this happens as well. So for example, this also occurs with international economic debates. And one of the best examples of this is a theological tenet called the responsible society. And the responsible society is an idea that comes out of the inaugural meeting of the World Council of Churches in 1948. And the responsible society is essentially the idea that economic power is beholden to God and to the welfare of the people affected by that economic power. And so Americans involved in the ecumenical movement take this idea to heart, and they understand it in several different ways. First, for the World Council of Churches, this was a way of getting around the divisions of the Cold War. So this is 1948, the Cold War has just begun, and so they see this, ecumenical Protestants see the responsible society as a kind of middle ground between capitalism and communism, and a way to get around the Iron Curtain and to have, right, a global standard that can bring people from across the world together. They also, ecumenical Protestants also see this as an endorsement of the welfare state. And so Americans involved in the ecumenical movement are inspired about these conversations that are happening in the global arena, and they use the responsible society to justify coming back to the United States and pushing for reforms that they hope will lead to the creation of the welfare state in the United States. So there are several ways in which, right, engagement internationally really helps ecumenical Protestants find justification and motivation for transforming life in the United States.
You've described the responsible society, which, by the way, what an amazing name for it. But it's an attempt to shape a middle ground, and I can only imagine there must have been critics Can you tell us a little bit about that?
There were quite a few, and you can imagine, proclaiming these things, trying to get around the Iron Curtain in 1948 is not a safe thing to do. There are several episodes that I recount that are consequences of this. So G. Bromley Oxnam gets brought before HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and is red baited and has to answer for his politics in front of a nationally televised audience. One of the more interesting stories for me is the ways in which this led to divisions and polarization, first among the ecumenical Protestant community and later in American politics. And so the person I often think of when I think about the emergence of these divisions is a former Congregationalist missionary named Walter Judd. Walter Judd was on Capitol Hill for a while. He was he had been a medical missionary in China from the 20s into the 30s, but when Japan invaded, he had to flee China and came back to the United States. He ran in an election and was elected, I think in 1942, to the House of Representatives, and so he became a congressman. And he was essentially on board with the ecumenical anti-racist agenda. So he was a leading figure in reforming US immigration law to get rid of Chinese exclusion and other racist provision in American immigration law from really the 40s into the 60s. But he was deeply critical of ideas like the responsible society. And as he was more and more publicly critical, you could see Walter Judd moving further and further away from the center of ecumenical life and the values that animated that life. And so there's a long, complicated story, but in essence, eventually in the 1950s, Walter Judd, who had been a Congregationalist and grew up in that community, ended up leading a split, a kind of fissure in that community, and starting his own denomination, which was more libertarian economically. And so while he's doing that, he was also cooperating much more closely with people like Billy Graham, who's the kind of the figurehead of the evangelical movement, and moving towards a closer cooperation with evangelicalism. And so what we see during this time is not only the splitting apart of denominations and the ecumenical Protestant community, we also see people like Judd taking some of the political capital that ecumenical Protestants had enjoyed for many decades and moving some of that political capital towards evangelicalism.
So this brings us towards some of the final parts of your narrative. And in your epilogue, you describe a sort of changing of the guard and how over a period of a few decades, the liberal Protestant side of the movement seems to have lost some vitality. Church membership begins to decline. They're not as involved or as effective politically. What's going on? What accounts for this loss of energy?
So by the 1960s, it becomes much more clear that the kinds of liberal and sometimes left-leaning values that are expressed by the national and international leadership of the ecumenical movement are not shared in local churches in the United States, which tend to be far more conservative. And so what happens is that many young people in the 1960s who grow up in Methodist or Episcopalian or Northern Presbyterian or Congregationalist denominations get on board with what the national and international leaders are saying about the welfare state, about the need to end segregation, about the need to get around the Cold War and to create global organizations that will bring people together. Young people get on board with these values, but they don't see those values expressed in their home churches. And so they oftentimes will leave their churches to find communities where those values are better expressed. And so many of them join organizations that are involved in the civil rights movement, say the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Many of them start getting involved in the burgeoning human rights movement in the 1960s. And so many young people, because they're inspired by the values that they don't see expressed in their churches, right, are disillusioned, and many of them leave and never return. At the same time as young people are leaving ecumenical churches, the more conservative folks who are staying behind, right, are also start expressing frustration with the international and national leadership of ecumenical Protestant institutions. And they start withholding funds, right, and start withholding donations from these organizations. And so you have the confluence of young people leaving the churches for more, for organizations that are more liberal and better express their values, and conservatives in the churches creating a kind of financial crisis. So you have a demographic shift and a financial crisis that becomes really important in the 1970s. And so there's a real sort of crisis, and people talk about the beginning of decline, right, of liberal Protestantism in the 1970s. And so I think that's real, and that's important to acknowledge, but I also think that that's only half the story. You have to talk about the financial and demographic crises, but you also have to acknowledge that the values that liberal ecumenical Protestant churches promoted and the institutions that they had helped create endure and outlast the decline of of ecumenical Protestantism's hegemony in American life.
So the other side of the story that you're telling during this period of time is also about the rise of evangelical movements and conservative Catholic movements and other groups that were organizing, becoming more powerful politically. I wonder, how did liberal Protestants, what was their role in this? Were they simply a foil that the evangelicals were reacting to? What was going on in this dynamic?
The modern evangelical movement was launched in 1942, which was the same year as the launch of the World Order movement. At first, evangelicals modeled their institutions on ecumenical Protestant institutions. So the Evangelical National Association of Evangelicals, created in 1942, was modeled on the Ecumenical Federal Council of Churches. The flagship evangelical journal, Christianity Today, still in existence, was modeled on the ecumenical journal, The Christian Century. And so there's a little bit of mirroring and imitation happening in the 1940s. But there's also an oppositional framework that's really important to evangelical politics. And so because ecumenical Protestants in the 1940s, during World War II, are so focused on international organizations, because human rights are such an important part of their politics and their ideas and values, evangelicals, in their oppositional attitudes towards their religious rivals, the ecumenical Protestants, they take a kind of opposite approach. And so Christian nationalism becomes a hugely important pillar of evangelical politics in the 1940s. We don't necessarily see that expressed in political life right away, because one of the main functions of ecumenical Protestants throughout their history has been to engage Americans with internationalism and to temper Christian nationalism. And so when you start seeing the power and hegemony of liberal ecumenical Protestants decline in American life, what happens is one of the most adept and competent opponents of Christian nationalism, right, lose some of their potency and open up space, right, much more kind of political and cultural space for the rise of Christian nationalism.
So Gene, I'm going to switch gears a little bit, but we work in the biggest library in the world, 170 million items and counting, and you spent some time here at the Kluge Center at the library. You've gone through archives and manuscripts. Tell us a little bit about what the process was like, and maybe if you've made any discoveries that you might want to share with folks.
the Library of Congress is such an amazing resource, and it's been thrilling to be here and to look, at a collection that includes virtually every single book that's ever been published. I relied on the collections here extensively for my first book. The collection that comes to mind most immediately is the G. Bromley Oxenham papers, and it includes many of the sources from which I drew to tell his stories about his travels. So he kept really detailed diaries, day to day, of each one of his trips. And so we could see the kinds of moves that he made, the kind of intellectual and political development over the course of the 20s and 30s happened for many people in his community. But we don't have the kind of granular level of detail, the way in which day to day his thinking is shifting with the things he's encountering. And so that's been a really rich resource and one of my favorite items to work with. I should also say that in contrast to G. Bromley Oxenham, there are people like Thelma Stevens who don't have an archive, who don't have a manuscript collection. This is a problem historians encounter all the time, right? The archival collections reflect many of the hierarchies of the era in which they were collected and many of the values. And so, forgotten figures like Thelma Stevens, if you want to tell their important stories, you have to be a little bit more creative and inventive, right? That's not to say I have any special method or any special way of doing this that other historians don't, but it is a call to be more attentive, right, when you're working in archives about what's missing, what's being left out, and why it's being left out.
So I have a couple more big questions, but before we do that, I want to open it up to the audience and see if we have questions from anyone in the public. We have some mics that are roaming, so if you have a question, please raise your hand. We have one over here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gene, and congratulations on the publication of your book, which unfortunately I haven't read yet, so I hope you forgive me. I have two related questions. I'm trying to understand the stakes of this fascinating research for you. So the first question is, you mentioned that you're not yourself a liberal Protestant, so what is, I guess, is this an admiring a recuperative history? Would you say the title suggests almost a nostalgic moment before religious Protestants became conservative, as it were, or not? You adumbrated that there are also problematic aspects to these people's politics, so I would love to hear about that. And the second question is about the relationship of activism to political power. It seems to me that we live in a golden age for the historiography of activist groups, certainly in U.S. history. But often these groups are being recuperated because they exist in opposition to power, whereas what you're describing is a much more harmonious, even cushy relationship. You describe this sort of trickle-up relationship. So I wondered whether you could reflect on that in terms of a history of activism. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those great questions. I've thought about this a lot, and I would say that no, it's not a recuperative project. History is a one-way stream. We can never go back, and nor should we want to go back. When I think about the politics of ecumenical Protestants, I oftentimes think of it as a kind of position paper liberalism, one focused more on presenting white papers, using quiet diplomacy behind the scenes rather than the kind of activist style of politics that we're much more familiar with today. And so they were definitely hemmed in by the sense of that being the proper way to act out politics, and they're also hemmed in by the desire to maintain consensus, which oftentimes comes at the expense of justice. And there are lots of examples of this sort of thing that I trace in my book, the kinds of limits on their politics. And I should say that, for women in this community, for example, this is a time when their power is probably decreasing to some extent rather than increasing. They're being incorporated into this ever larger bureaucracy, and they're losing positions of power. African Americans rarely have positions of authority in this community, although they do change it and reshape it in really important ways. And so for all these reasons, including, the kind of mono-religious hegemony before, there's more sort of inclusion for Catholics and Jews and secular people, right? People who don't have any religious affiliation at all. For all these reasons, right, I think we shouldn't be too celebratory of this community, and we should be critical of their many shortcomings. I also think that when you think about the broader religious landscape in the United States and what this group is able to do on behalf of, in the way they've marshaled the cultural capital of Christianity, I think from that perspective, this is hugely important. I found it really surprising that so many American elites who have a tremendous amount of cultural and political capital chose to spend that capital in this particular way. To me, that's something that demands explanation. And I think it's important, right, to understand that even though there are many things we'd want to criticize and change about this community, I think at the same time we have to recognize some of the contributions they've made, right, over the course of the 20th century. Thanks for your question.
We have questions here in the middle. Why don't we go to the back? Okay, we'll come back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very interesting. And I think I'm especially, of course, interested in this story about Oxnam going to the Soviet Union in 1926. And as you said, coming back and becoming sort of an expert. And I was wondering what kind of expertise then was the one that he was willing to offer. I'm thinking about André Gide in France, who went to the Soviet Union a bit later and came back with a very critical perception of the Soviet Union. And I was wondering, like, these days we often conceptualize the Soviet project as an alternative to build a different type of modernity than the Western one. So did he see it in this way? Did he saw Soviet Union as some sort of a radical project, radically different from the American way of life? And if he did, was this perception positive or negative? Or did he think that the West should engage with the Soviet Union because you should engage with your enemy, or because there was something to learn from the Soviet project?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And I think many aspects of this, you would know more about this than I would. But in terms of the kind of separate Soviet civilization, I don't think he's read Stephen Kotkin, so he didn't have that interpretation. G. Bromley Oxnam was thinking about the Soviet Union through the lens of the experience of ecumenical Protestants back home in the United States. He was thinking about it through his experience with fundamentalist Protestants. In the 1920s, right, 1925 was the Scopes monkey trial, right? There was a real sense of rivalry with fundamentalists in the United States at that moment. And so when he was thinking about the Soviet Union, he was thinking about the kind of religion that had prevailed there in relationship to what was going on back home in the United States. And so when he was trying to figure out why the Soviet Union was an atheistic country and why it was opposed so strongly to religion. And looking at it through that American lens, he characterized the Orthodox Church in Russia as sort of similar to fundamentalism in the United States, a backward religion, one that was superstitious, that wasn't at home with science in the way that liberal Protestantism was. And so for him, right, the position he took is it's no wonder that the Soviet Union was so anti-religious, because this is the kind of religion they were encountering there. But soon he hoped that there would be, a new kind of religion that emerged that was more like his in the Soviet Union, and that Soviet officials would understand that not all religion is reactionary, and in fact you can find common ground. So that was his interpretation, and what was remarkable is many figures, even into the Cold War, when they were thinking about, say, Mao's takeover of China, mainland China in the 1940s, exactly the same interpretation, right? What we need to show the Communist Party in China is that many of the values that they share, if you just take away the atheist part of it, right, are being expressed by this ecumenical, liberal, religious communities. And so for them, that was the framework within which they saw it.
Let's come here to the back row.
Thank you, Jean, for this insight into your fascinating research. Can we track back to World War II? And if I remember correctly, you told us this community described themselves, some of them as pacifist and some of them as realist.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering how the dialogue around peace developed between those parts of the community, and because it was during this time that you said this project and campaign for a kind of global just peace emerged. What were they drawing on to imagine those possibilities, if you have information about that? And how did they develop that dialogue between pacifists and realists?
So the dialogue was not very cordial. It was quite passionate, and one of the fault lines that developed was when Herbert Hoover, who is the former president of the United States in 1940, he was a former vice president of the Federal Council of Churches as well. He revives his plan from World War I to try to send food aid to the countries, Belgium and Netherlands, that had been conquered by Nazi Germany. So he's trying that earlier food plan again in 1940, and it leads to really bitter personal fights and all kinds of splits between the realists and pacifists. So that's sort of one of the fault lines that develops. Essentially, the fights are never resolved. People like G. Bromley Oxnam, when he's gathering conferences to try to plan out the post-war future, he places a gag rule, right? Like, don't talk about the war. So that's what it essentially comes to. Now, given that fact, there are distinct things when they're imagining the post-war peace that realists and pacifists are bringing to the table. So some of the most famous realists are people like Reinhold Niebuhr, John Coleman Bennett, you can place Dulles maybe in that camp as well. They're thinking about quite seriously structures of world order, the need to sort of balance power. So they're coming at the post-war peace through that kind of a framework. Pacifists are much more in tune with racial justice, with imperialism, and so when they're thinking about the post-war peace, they're much more attuned to the kind of progressive reforms that become a mainstay of the world order movement and some of the transformations in the United States. So the way in which the ecumenical Protestant community comes to imagine the post-war peace really owes a debt to both of these traditions. So they can't talk about the war, right? But they're bringing their own viewpoints to the coming peace and are both in their own way shaping what's going to come after World War II.
We have time for one more question, if there's any from the audience. One more over here.
I'd like to hear about theology and exegesis a little bit. I was wondering whether particular traditions, particular theologians, particular readings of particular biblical passages, are found frequently in your corpus, and what those are.
When I began this project, I believed that I was going to be mostly writing a book about Protestant theology. And so I, went to audited seminary classes, and I, learned all about Karl Barth, thinking that this must be the most important thing, right, for this community. I was surprised to learn that that wasn't the case. When I figured out who was involved in the most important political initiatives of the era, it was everybody but theologians. There were social ethicists, there were historians, there were lawyers and bureaucrats and all kinds of people, pretty much everybody other than theologians. And so that was one surprising discovery, right, is the absence of theologians and theology, sort of narrowly speaking. But there were two things that came up over and over and over again. One is a theological tradition that's really a more philosophical tradition. It came out of Boston University philosophy departments called personalism. And that was the doctrine that was most responsible for justifying and framing human rights. So one thing I would draw attention to is the history of Protestant personalism as being especially significant. The other thing that struck me as especially important in writing this book is a branch of theology called ecclesiology. This is really getting to the weeds a little bit, but ecclesiology is essentially the branch of theology that deals with the nature and the structure of the church. And the way in which that became a lively discussion is a conversation that took place when you had kind of the laity rebelling against the clergy. There was this question raised about ecclesiology, which is, are Protestant denominations democratic? Right? If you are a Catholic and you're asking the question, is Catholicism democratic? Well, you would say, yeah, in some ways, but of course the magisterium is not up for majority vote, right? But if you're in a community, right, where it is a priesthood of all believers, right, it's more complicated and nuanced, especially if you subscribe to a branch of ecclesiology called the congregational model, where each church is supposed to kind of choose its own theology for itself, right? And so there are these really interesting both theological and political conversations, right, about who gets to speak for the church. That has very much to do with what is the nature of the church, right? Should the laity, should the majority of churchgoers be the ones to decide what Christian theology has to say about, the Social Security Act or the UN Declaration of Human Rights? Or is it, more in the province of the clergy or the national leaders, right? So these become real vital debates.
So Gene, one final question. I know you're a historian, and historians don't always like to make predictions about the future because those are wrought with all sorts of risk. But I'm going to ask you anyway. You've written about certain big trends, and one of them, of course, is the loss of a degree of loss of influence of liberal Protestant groups. Do you see this trend continuing into the future? What do you see on the horizon, congregation-wise? Are folks continuing to leave these churches? But also, you've also described the rise of the evangelicals and other groups that are becoming involved politically, and on paper at least, or generally, there's a lot of disagreements between these groups. Is there any area where you see convergences, where these groups might see eye to eye in terms of policy positions, in terms of what they're concerned about?
I've been thinking about these questions a lot, and they're really difficult ones, but I'll try to answer these. So in terms of cooperation between evangelicals and ecumenical Protestants, if there's an arena for this, it would be in the international humanitarian area. Since the 1970s, evangelical Protestants have built massive humanitarian organizations that provide relief for famine, AIDS victims across the world. And so I think if there's one area where these two movements can overlap and work together, it's probably in international humanitarianism. In terms of the trends with demographics, it's a difficult question, but I think that probably the most important trend for the last 20 or 30 years has been the rise of the nuns. These are N-O-N-E-S, not like N-U-N-S, the women who wear habits. The nuns are also called the unaffiliated. These are people, when they're asked, what is your religion? And they're given a list of choices, they say none of the above, right? Hence, nuns. They have been growing rapidly, and today they make up the largest group, not the majority, but the largest group of, quote unquote, religious, the largest religious group in the United States. This was a trend that began first in ecumenical Protestant communities in the late 1960s as young people started to disaffiliate. And when scholars noticed this happening, they called it secularization. And then they kind of paused when they saw that this at first wasn't happening to evangelical Protestants, right? They were much better, at least for a time, in keeping hold of young people and keeping their communities together. But scholars, I think, more and more are recognizing that this was, at best, a temporary event, that at best that evangelicals had experienced a kind of delayed secularization. And so now they're starting to see the impact of the very same thing that had earlier happened to ecumenical Protestants. So one famous example of this is that Southern Baptists, the largest denomination in the United States, is having a lot of trouble over the last 10 years or so baptizing millennials, right, let alone, Gen Zers. And so they're experiencing many of these same kinds of problems. And of course, the dynamics in evangelical communities are likely to be very similar to those in ecumenical communities. As young people leave evangelical churches, as they had done ecumenical churches, the most likely thing we're going to see happen is that these communities will become even more conservative. Right? And so what you're likely to see is a country that is going to become more unaffiliated, right, or more secular, if you prefer that term, while also having religious groups that are more kind of monocultural and monopolitical and really well organized as well, that are going to continue to probably intensify even, right, to bring their values and politics to bear on the United States. So the kinds of religious quarrels we've seen, the kind of polarization we're experiencing is not likely to end anytime soon.
Gene, thanks so much for being with us. That was Gene Zubovich with Before the Religious Right, Liberal Protestants, Human Rights, and the Polarization of the United States. Thanks again, and please check our website for upcoming events.